There's a kind of silence that doesn't belong to any place in particular. It isn't the silence of the desert at midday, when the heat presses down on everything and the lizards go still, and even the wind decides it has better things to do. It isn't the silence of a church, or a graveyard, or the moment after a gunshot when every man in a saloon holds his breath and waits to see who's bleeding. This was the silence of a woman who had already decided she was invisible. I've logged a lot of things in the years I've been riding through this territory. I started keeping a journal when I was 19, after my first cattle drive, when my uncle told me that a man who doesn't record what he sees will forget more than he ever learned. So I write. Not poetically, my handwriting looks like a drunk snake dragged itself across wet paper, but I write. Dates, weather, distances, the occasional observation that surprises me in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I did not expect to write about a woman at a train station. Certainly not this woman. Certainly not the way she was standing, not waiting, not pacing, not performing any of the nervous theater that people enact on train platforms when they're unsure what comes next. She was simply there, upright, still. Dressed in a calico blouse that didn't quite fit across the shoulders, a skirt that had been hemmed by someone who wasn't thinking about the wearer, her dark hair braided with a single strip of red cloth wound through it, the only color on her that looked like it had been chosen on purpose. Every other person on that platform was moving, porters with trunks, a mother chasing a child, two men arguing about a shipping schedule in the shade of the station overhang. She didn't move. I almost walked past her. God help me, I almost walked past her entirely. What stopped me wasn't heroism. It wasn't nobility or frontier chivalry or any of the things the dime novels would want you to believe about a man like me. What stopped me was the journal, my uncle's voice in the back of my head. A man who doesn't record what he sees. I saw her, and once I saw her, truly saw her, not the calico blouse or the ill-fitting skirt or the red cloth in her hair, but her. I couldn't write fast enough to keep up with what I was learning. This is my best attempt. What the train left behind. The station at Riverbend was not a place anyone loved. It existed because the railroad demanded it exist, a midpoint between the cattle processing yards to the east and the mining towns to the west, a place where freight changed hands and travelers stopped long enough to remember they were thirsty. The building itself was weatherboard and corrugated tin, painted a shade of brown that the sun had spent several years draining the dignity out of. There was a water pump on the north side that wheezed when you worked the handle. There was a bench on the platform that had a crack down the middle long enough to swallow a man's boot heel. There was a clock on the interior wall that ran 12 minutes fast, which the station master either didn't know or didn't care about. I had arrived on the eastbound that morning at 7:30, or what the station clock insisted was 20 past, which gave me a moment of panic before I remembered to transfer a bill of sale for 40 head of cattle that were traveling without me. The paperwork took longer than it should have. Everything at Riverbend took longer than it should have. I had retreated to the platform with a cup of coffee I'd purchased from a woman selling from a basket near the entrance, and I was standing in the thin strip of shadow along the station wall, watching the westbound platform and considering whether I had time to send a wire before my ride arrived. That was when I noticed her. She was standing at the far end of the westbound platform, which was separated from mine by a set of tracks, and about 60 feet of open ground baking in the August heat. The westbound had already come and gone. I'd watched it pull away 20 minutes earlier, passengers loading and a few unloading, the usual controlled chaos collapsing back into stillness once the engine was out of sight. She hadn't boarded. I might have assumed she was waiting for the next one, except the next westbound wasn't until 4 in the afternoon. That was 6 hours from now, and she had no luggage. No bag, no trunk, nothing beside her on the platform. Just herself, standing with her hands loose at her sides, looking at the place where the train had been. I watched her for a while. There's no more honest way to say it. I watched her the way you watch something that doesn't quite fit the frame of what you expect to see, the way you watch a hawk sitting still on a fence post in the middle of a storm when every other bird has found shelter. Not aggressively, not rudely, I hope, but attentively. After a few minutes, she sat down. Not on the cracked bench. There was a man on it, asleep with his hat over his face. But on the edge of the platform itself, her feet dangling above the tracks, Her back straight as if sitting on the edge of a train platform in the middle of August was simply where she had decided to be. I finished my coffee. I looked at the telegraph office. I looked at her. I wrote in my journal, "Woman on West platform, no luggage, no party, train gone, still here." Then I looked at what I'd written, which told me almost nothing, and added, "Something's wrong." Getting across to the westbound platform required going through the station building and out the other side, which took me past the station master's window. His name was Connolly, according to the plate on the wall, and he was the kind of man who had arranged his face permanently into an expression of mild suffering, as though the world owed him an apology and had not yet delivered it. "The woman on the west platform," I said. He looked up from his ledger. "What about her?" It wasn't really a question. It had the shape of one, but the weight of something that didn't want to be examined. "How long has she been there?" He looked back at his ledger. "Came in on the eastbound 2 days ago." I let that settle for a moment. 2 days. "That's what I said." "Has she eaten? Has anyone?" "I gave her water yesterday." He said this in a way that suggested he considered the matter resolved. "She's not on railroad property. She's on the platform." "Platform's public." 2 days, I said again. "Mister, I don't know what you want me to tell you. She came with a group, white man, couple of women, 3 Apache men. Whole group boarded the westbound. She didn't." He turned a page in his ledger. "I asked her twice if she needed assistance. She didn't answer. Could be she doesn't speak English. Could be she just doesn't want to talk to me." He paused. "Can't say I blame her, frankly. I don't particularly want to talk to me either most mornings." I stared at him. There was something in what he'd said. She came with a group, whole group boarded the westbound. She didn't, that was arranging itself into a picture I didn't like. "She was left," I said. He closed the ledger. "I don't deal in conclusions, son. I deal in arrivals and departures." He picked up his pen. "Now if you're not here about freight, I've got a manifest to finish." She heard me coming before I reached her. I've noticed that about people who have spent time in open country, Apache people especially, from what I'd seen over the years, they track sound differently. They don't ignore peripheral noise the way townspeople learn to. They file it. By the time I'd walked the length of the westbound platform, she had clocked me, assessed me, and returned her gaze to the tracks without turning her head, all while appearing not to have moved at all. Up close, I could see things I hadn't been able to from across the tracks. She was young. I'd put her somewhere in her mid-20s, though I'm not reliable at ages. Her face was angular and precise, the kind of structure that doesn't soften easily, that holds its own geometry even when everything around it is loose and uncertain. There was a bruise along her left jaw that was 3 or 4 days old, yellowing at the edges. Her hands, resting on her knees, were steady. The red cloth in her braid was silk or something close to it, out of place with everything else she was wearing, but intact. Cared for. I stopped about 6 feet from her, which I thought was far enough to be non-threatening without being so far that I was shouting across a distance, and I took my hat off because my mother raised me, and I remembered at least some of what she taught me. "Ma'am," I said, "my name's Eli Garrett. I work cattle out of the Brannock spread north of here. I'm not looking for anything from you, and I'm not going to pretend I don't see that something's gone wrong." I paused. "I have some cornbread in my saddle bag that I bought this morning. I could get it if you'd want it. I'm not carrying it as leverage. It's there." She didn't look at me, but her hands shifted slightly on her knees. "I'll get it," I said. Her name, I learned over the next hour, was Sa. Or at least, that was the syllable she offered when I asked, touching her collarbone briefly in the way people do when they want to make sure the sound lands on the right person. I repeated it back, and she nodded once, which I took as acceptable. She ate the cornbread methodically. Not hungrily, not in the way of someone who'd been ignoring hunger, but with a focused deliberateness that told me she'd been conserving herself for several days, managing her energy the way you manage a lamp when you're not sure how much oil is left. Her English was limited but not absent. It came in pieces, nouns first, then occasionally a verb, rarely an adjective, never an apology. She had been in a Methodist mission school for 2 years when she was a child, she indicated, holding up 2 fingers. She had left when her mother was sick. Sick, then gone, she said, with the flatness of someone who has said a hard thing so many times that they've learned to say it without attaching any extra weight to it. The group she'd come with, I gathered slowly and with significant gaps in my comprehension, had been a family group traveling west to meet with a government representative about land. The white man was some kind of intermediary, agent, broker. She didn't have a word for it that we shared, and the others were her husband's family. Her husband's family. I asked about the husband. She looked at the tracks. Then she said in English that was careful and deliberate, "He married again before we arrived." The silence that followed was the kind that requires nothing from either person. I understood enough. The picture I'd been assembling since the station master's window arranged itself now with a horrible clarity. A man who had taken an Apache wife, for alliance, for convenience, for whatever reason men used to justify taking things they later abandon, had boarded the westbound with a new arrangement and left his previous one standing on the platform. His family had gone with him. Everyone had gone with him. Whether they knew and approved or were simply following the man, I couldn't say, and it made me furious in different ways depending on which answer was true. What I could say with certainty was this. Saw had been on this platform for 2 days with no money, no luggage, no ration, and nowhere to go. She had not asked anyone for help. She had not cried, as far as I could tell, or not in front of anyone. She had sat on the edge of the platform with her back straight and her hands steady, and she had waited, not for rescue, I don't think. Not for someone to come. I think she was waiting for herself to decide what to do next, and that decision was taking time because there were very few good options, and she was smart enough to know it. I sat down next to her on the platform edge, which was an uncomfortable perch, and I did not say anything useful for a while. I watched a hawk cross the sky above the water tower. I listened to the wheeze of the pump on the north side of the building. Then I said, "I need to get to the Brannock spread by nightfall. It's north, 11 miles, give or take." I thought about how to phrase the next part. "I'm not asking you to come. I'm telling you it's north, in case north is a useful direction for you." She looked at me then, for the first time, fully direct. I don't know what she was looking for. I don't know if she found it. But she looked for long enough that I felt evaluated in a way I couldn't pretend wasn't happening. And I held still under it the way you hold still when you need someone to decide you're not a threat. "Brannock," she said, "is this a good place?" "It's a working place," I said. "The cook is decent rancher's fare." "Fair," she repeated, as if she was testing the word's structural integrity. "As far as I know." She looked back at the tracks. I opened my journal and wrote one line. Today I told a stranger she could come with me and didn't know if that was the right thing or just the only thing I could think of. Then I put the journal away and waited for her to decide. She stood up. She didn't say yes or no. She simply stood up, straightened the skirt that didn't fit across the hem, and looked at me with an expression that said, "Well, let's see about north then." I got to my feet, put my hat back on, and tried not to look as relieved as I felt. We walked off the platform together, past the station master's window. Connolly didn't look up, but I saw the pen pause, and out into the August light, which was brutal and indifferent and falling on both of us equally. My horse, a bay mare named Consistent, was hitched to the post out front. She'd been standing there for 2 hours and was communicating her displeasure through the angle of her ears, which I chose to interpret as enthusiasm. "She bites," I said, then immediately regretted it because that wasn't useful information for someone deciding whether to get on. Saw looked at Consistent. Consistent looked back. Then Saw put out her hand, not to pet her, just to hold it flat in the space between them, and Consistent stretched her neck and sniffed it. And something passed between the horse and the woman that I couldn't account for and didn't try to. "She will not bite me," Saw said, not a question. "No," I agreed. "I don't think she will." We started north. 11 miles, give or take. I wrote nothing in my journal for the first 3 miles, because there was nothing to add to what had already happened, and because some things need to be ridden through before they can be written down. What I did do, somewhere around the 2nd mile, when the station had disappeared behind the low ridge, and there was nothing ahead of us but grass and distance, and the particular blue of a New Mexico sky that never gets any less extraordinary no matter how many times you see it. What I did was look sideways at the woman riding behind me, her spine straight, her braid catching the sun, that strip of red silk the brightest thing in all that landscape, and I thought. She was left on a platform and she's still upright. Whatever comes next, she's earned the right to it. What hands learn when they're working. I should tell you about Brannick before I tell you about what happened when we arrived. Because the ranch was a personality before it was a place, and you needed to understand the personality to understand the place. Dermot Brannick was 63 years old, built like something that had been hit repeatedly by weather and become more itself in the process, with a face that had apparently spent the last 3 decades outdoors conducting a personal dispute with the sun, and showed every year of it. He had come from County Clare in Ireland at age 17 with $9, a good back, and a stubbornness so profound it had become indistinguishable from principle. He had been married twice. The first wife died of fever, the second had left him when he was 40, which he spoke of without bitterness in a way that suggested he'd accepted his share of the blame and put it somewhere manageable. He ran cattle. He ran them honestly. He paid his men, he fed them well, he expected work and returned respect. And if he held opinions about the various peoples who occupied or had occupied this land, he held them quietly enough that they had never interfered with his behavior. His cook, a woman named Esperanza who had been with the ranch for 11 years, was Yaki. She cooked with a ferocity that bordered on territorial and made coffee that would rearrange your understanding of the beverage. I mention these details because they affected what happened. We arrived at the Brannick spread at 3:30, which gave us enough light to see the place clearly before the afternoon's heat began to soften toward evening. It was a working ranch without aspirations to be anything else. The main house, 2 bunkhouses, a barn, a cook shack, several corrals in various states of repair, a windmill that worked, a second windmill that was being persuaded to work by one of the hands, who I could see from the gate still wrestling with something near the base of the mechanism. Several of the other men were returning from the north pasture, a loose group of riders trailing dust. I was aware as we came through the gate that Saw was visible. That's an inadequate way to put it, but it's the accurate one. She was visible in the way that anything unexpected is visible in a familiar landscape. The ranch hands looked. Not aggressively, not immediately with hostility, but they looked with the particular attention of men who don't expect what they're seeing. I kept my spine straight and my pace normal and pulled up in front of the main house, where Brannick was sitting on the porch doing the thing he did every afternoon at this hour, which was reading his Bible with his glasses perched on the end of his nose in a way that suggested he was having an ongoing argument with the text and was not yet losing. "Garrett," he said without looking up, "you get the bill of sale sorted." I did. He turned a page. "Who have you got with you?" "A woman named Sa," I said. "She was left at the Riverbend station by her husband's family 2 days ago. She needs work and a place to sleep that isn't a train platform." I paused. "I told her I thought you were fair." He looked up at that, over the glasses. First at me, then at Saw, then back at me, then at Saw again, in the measuring way of a man who has learned that first looks are rarely last looks. Saw met his gaze directly. She did not look down. She did not perform deference. She simply held herself where she was and let him look. "Apache," he said. "Yes," she said. "You work cattle." "I work," a pause. "I will learn cattle." Brannick's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. He closed the Bible and took off his glasses and folded them. "Esperanza," he called back through the screen door. "We've got a new one." What followed was 6 weeks. I'll compress most of them, because what happened inside those 6 weeks isn't a single event, but a series of small ones that accumulated, meaning the way water accumulates in a low place, slowly, until you look up and realize there's something there that wasn't there before. Saw slept in the room at the back of the cook shack that had been empty since the previous kitchen hand had left in March. It was small and smelled of cumin and wood smoke, which I think suited her better than the bunkhouse would have. Esperanza assessed her in the first hour with the same ferocity she applied to everything, and within 3 days had determined that Saw had no kitchen training worth the name but excellent instincts and the specific patience required for tasks that required repetition without shortcuts. She put her on bread first, because bread was honest. It either worked or it didn't, and excuses were irrelevant to the outcome. The bread worked. Esperanza moved her to the stew, which was more complex, and then to the management of the root cellar, which required the kind of inventory discipline that not everyone had. Saw had it in abundance. I think she'd spent enough years managing limited resources in limited spaces that the root cellar was, in its own way, familiar territory. Outside the kitchen, she watched everything. That was the word for it, she watched. Not passively, not from a position of waiting to be included. She watched the way you watch when you're building a map of a new country from observation because no one's going to hand you one. She watched the men work the cattle, watched how the branding was done, watched the water management, watched the way the horses were evaluated and rotated. She asked no questions for the first week. In the second week, she asked one per day, and they were always precise, always aimed at the specific thing she didn't understand rather than the general concept, which told you something about how her mind organized information. I had occasion to talk with her most evenings, in the gap between supper and darkness when the hands were settling down and the day was releasing its hold on things. We'd sit on the fence rail at the near corral, or sometimes on the porch step if Brannick was already inside, and we'd talk in the way you talk when neither of you is entirely certain where the edges of the conversation are. I told her about cattle. She told me about the country north of Riverbend, which she'd ridden through as a child, following seasonal routes she mapped in her memory without paper or compass. I told her about my uncle and the journal. She was quiet for a moment and then said my grandmother kept accounts also. In her memory, all the plants, all the water, she tapped her temple. Here. No paper needed if you practice. I wrote that down that evening. I always wrote down the things she said that surprised me, because she said things that surprised me more often than anyone else I'd met in recent years, and I was concerned I'd forget the exact texture of them. The trouble started in the third week. It started with a man named Cutter, not his birth name, obviously, but the only one anyone at Brannick's used, who was one of the older hands, competent at his work and unpleasant in his opinions, which he held with the enthusiasm of someone who had confused certainty for intelligence. He hadn't said anything directly harmful in the first 2 weeks, but he had a way of speaking near people rather than to them, letting comments fall into a room without claiming them, which is a coward's method of causing damage and one I'd seen before. The direct thing happened at supper in the third week. I wasn't there when it started. I came in from the east pasture to find Sa standing at the kitchen window, not moving, with her back to the room in a way that wasn't natural stillness but controlled stillness, the kind you hold when you're deciding whether to turn around. Cutter was at the table with 2 of the other hands, and he was speaking in the conversational volume of a man who wanted to be overheard. What he said isn't worth repeating in full. The shape of it was this: that Apache women at a cattle ranch were a liability, that he'd known her kind, that her husband had likely left her for a sufficient reason, that women who dressed the way she did were sending a particular message about what they were willing to trade. I stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, I watched Sa's back. I watched the set of her shoulders. I watched her hands, which were on the window ledge, grip once and then release. Then she turned around. She didn't look at me. She looked at Cutter with an expression that I don't know how to fully describe except to say it was the opposite of what he expected, because what he expected was either tears or anger, or the kind of small, frightened withdrawal that would have confirmed his narrative. And what he got instead was a woman looking at him with the complete, focused calm of someone who has already decided that this man does not have enough substance to generate genuine fear in her, that he is an obstacle at most. A temporary weather event, not a force of nature, but an inconvenience with opinions. "You are loud," she said. "Your voice fills more space than your thoughts do." The table went quiet. Cutter opened his mouth. "Sit down, Cutter," said Brannick. None of us had heard him come in. He was standing behind me in the doorway, holding his hat, and his voice was the specific quiet of a man who is prepared to become significantly louder, and is giving everyone present the opportunity to avoid that. Cutter sat down. Brannick looked at Sa. "You all right?" She thought about it for a moment, which I appreciated, the genuine consideration of the question rather than the reflexive response. "Yes," she said, "I am all right." "Good," he hung his hat on the peg. "What's for supper?" Later that night, I found a page in my journal from that first day at the station and read what I'd written: woman on West Platform. No luggage, no party, train gone, still here, and then I wrote below it, she is still here. The here is different now, she is still here. It's not poetic. My uncle would have said to try again with that one, but it was accurate, and accuracy was what I had. The morally heavy thing happened in week 5. A man arrived at the ranch, rode in from the south, asking for Brannock, gave his name as teller. He was the kind of man who wore his authority like clothing he'd borrowed and wasn't fully certain fit him. Government of some kind, Indian affairs, he said, though he didn't produce any documentation, which I noted with the professional suspicion that years of business dealings had installed in me regarding men who stated their authority without supporting it. He knew about Saw. Not by name but by description, Apache woman, arrived at the ranch around a certain date unattached. He said there was a situation to resolve, which was his word. He said the woman had been part of a formal agreement between her family and a settler's family, that the nature of the marriage arrangement had certain legal dimensions that were being reviewed, and that he was there to facilitate her return to the proper jurisdiction. Brannock listened to all of this from his porch chair without moving. "Whose jurisdiction would that be?" he said. Teller named a place and named some names. He had the smoothness of a man who believed that information, delivered with sufficient confidence, was the same as authority. "Does the woman know you're here?" Brannock said. "That's not. Simple question." Teller said that wasn't really relevant to the process. I was standing at the far end of the porch. I did not speak, because it wasn't my place to speak yet, and because I had learned over the years that speaking too early in a situation like this used up room that might be needed later. Brannock stood up. He was not a tall man, but he had the quality of seeming larger when he stood, which I think was a function of how still he held himself. "You'll forgive me," he said, in a tone that indicated forgiveness was not actually on offer, "if I ask you to wait here while I have a conversation with my employee." He went inside. I followed. Saw was in the kitchen. She knew something was happening. She'd seen the man ride in, had watched from the kitchen window. When we came in, she looked at Brannock, not at me, which was the correct instinct because Brannock was the one with the land and the name. He told her plainly what the man had said and what he wanted. She listened. Her face changed very little, but her hands did. They moved to the hem of her apron and held it, the way hands reach for something solid when the ground shifts. "You do not have to go," Brannock said, "but I want you to understand your choices. If this man has real legal authority, refusing him could create complications that would land somewhere. For you, possibly for this ranch." He paused. "I'm not going to hand you over to him, but I want you informed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are asking me what I want." "Yes. My husband's family made an agreement. My husband broke the agreement when he left me. In my law, in Apache law, what I am now," she considered the word, "is free of the obligation. I do not belong to that agreement anymore." "You're saying the marriage is dissolved." "I am saying the agreement that placed me with that family is dissolved. Whether the white man's law agrees." She made a small, precisely expressionless gesture with one hand that said more about the history of white men's law and Apache women than I could have put into any number of journal entries. "If I go with him," she said, "I will be returned to people who did not want me. If I stay here," she looked around the kitchen, at the shelves she'd organized, at the window with its view of the corral, "I would like to stay here." "Then stay," Brannock said. It wasn't that simple. Of course it wasn't that simple. What followed was 40 minutes of Brannock and Teller discussing things on the porch in voices I could hear rising and falling without catching the words, while I sat in the kitchen with Saw, and we both pretended to be occupied with things we weren't occupied with, and I wrote nothing in my journal because I couldn't settle my hands enough. When Brannock came back inside, he said only, "He's leaving." I looked at him. "Whether he has real authority is unclear," Brannock said. "Whether he'll pursue it is his business, we'll see." He picked up his coffee cup. "If he comes back with papers, we'll deal with papers." He looked at Saw. "We'll deal with it." She nodded. She reached for a dish towel and folded it with the specific, focused precision of someone who is managing a significant emotion by completing a simple task correctly. I understand that feeling. I use journal entries for the same purpose. That night I sat on the fence rail alone and wrote a long entry that I won't reproduce here, because some of it is too unformed to be useful, and some of it is too personal to be offered without better language than I had that night. What I kept coming back to was a thing she had said, somewhere in the middle of week 4, on a morning when we'd both been up before the others and shared coffee in the early silence. She'd been watching the sunrise over the eastern ridge, which came in slowly that day, building in stages of rose and copper and eventual gold, and she had said without looking at me, "People think beauty is quiet, but it is not quiet it presses, it asks something of you." I had written it down immediately. I didn't know at the time what she meant. I didn't know if I was meant to know. Sitting on the fence rail that night, in the full darkness, I thought I was beginning to understand. The things you learn from being seen. Teller came back 6 days later. He came with a man who had a badge, which was different from the first visit, and the presence of the badge changed the atmosphere around the conversation the way a cold front changes the air before you can see the sky has changed. I was at the barn when they arrived. I saw them ride in from the South Trail, 2 men, one with a badge catching the morning light. I finished what I was doing at the barn, not because I wasn't alarmed, but because walking out of a barn in a hurry announces something, and the situation didn't need announcing too. And then I walked to the house at a normal pace and told Brannick who was at his gate. He stood up, set down the Bible, and said, "Garrett, fetch Esperanza. Tell her to bring Saw in from the root cellar, and the 2 of them are to stay in the cook shack until I say otherwise." "What are you going to do?" "Talk," he said, "like a man who employs a competent attorney in Fort Worth and has the Telegraph account to prove it." He paused at the door. "I sent a wire 3 days ago. Should have an answer by now." I looked at him. "Man has a badge," he said. "Doesn't necessarily mean a man has a case. Go get Esperanza." I don't know everything that happened on that porch. What I know is that Esperanza and I stayed in the cook shack with Saw for the better part of 2 hours, and that those 2 hours had a quality of suspended time that I associate with moments where something important is being decided that you're not in the room for. Esperanza made coffee and did not offer commentary. Saw sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, not performing calm, genuinely engaged in making a decision about how much of her energy to spend on fear and how much to hold in reserve. At one point she said, without particular urgency, "If they make me go." "We're not there yet," Esperanza said. "I know I am preparing for possibilities." She looked at Esperanza with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Preparation is not defeat." Esperanza set down her coffee, looked at Saw, and said something in a mix of Yaqui and Spanish that I didn't catch all of. But Saw's face changed when she heard it. Something unlocked slightly around the eyes, and she nodded. I asked later what Esperanza had said. Esperanza told me it translated roughly as, "A woman who prepares is a woman who intends to continue. That's not defeat. That's tomorrow already beginning." The badge man left before noon. I watched him ride out from the window. He and Teller both, South Trail, no more leisurely about it than they'd arrived, but not lingering either. When Brannick came into the cook shack, he sat down at the table across from Saw and put a folded paper on the surface between them. "This is a response from my attorney," he said. "The short version is that the arrangement this Teller fellow is claiming has no legal standing under territorial law. The marriage, if it can be called that, and my attorney has some feelings about that, was conducted under terms that don't translate to a legally enforceable claim on your person or your whereabouts." He tapped the paper. The badge man, as it turns out, was county, not federal. My attorney's letter made clear that if he tried to make any formal action out of this, it would go to a judge who has dealt with my attorney before, and they have a working relationship. Saw looked at the paper. "What this means," Brannick said carefully, "is that as far as the law that applies in this territory is concerned, you're a free person who works on this ranch. That's all. Nobody gets to come in here and say otherwise." A silence. Then she said, "Why did you do this, the attorney, the wire?" Brannick considered the question with the respect it deserved. "Because I said I'd deal with it," he said finally, "and because I needed to be able to look at myself in the morning." He pushed back from the table. "I'll note that the answer to your second question also applies to the first." He got up and left the kitchen. Esperanza poured more coffee. The weeks that followed had a different quality. I've tried to understand what changed, and the best I can manage is this. When a threat has been named and addressed, the space it occupied becomes available for something else. That's not relief exactly. Relief is the absence of fear. This was more like room. The way a room feels different when heavy furniture has been moved out and you haven't yet decided what to put there instead. Saw began to teach. It happened gradually, and she didn't announce it, which was consistent with everything else about her. She had a way of initiating things that looked like continuation, so you were already in the middle of them before you'd noticed they'd started. She taught Esperanza 2 or 3 plants she knew, nothing I can name with certainty but specific things that grew along the North Ridge, that she'd identified in her first week on walks that I hadn't known she was taking. Esperanza began using one of them in the kitchen. What it tasted like or what it did, I couldn't say, but Esperanza seemed satisfied with the results. She taught one of the younger hands, a boy of about 17 named Petty who was earnest about horses but still nervous around them in ways that horses can tell. She taught him to approach from a different angle. Not physically, exactly. More about where your energy is when you come at an animal, what your body communicates before you've done anything yet. I watched this happen over 3 sessions on 3 separate mornings, and by the 4th morning Petty was working with the skittish roan that nobody had been able to handle without incident, and the horse was calm under his hands. Petty didn't know how to thank her. He wasn't sophisticated enough in the ways of gratitude to know what to offer, so he just started putting an extra biscuit on her plate at breakfast every morning for 2 weeks, which she accepted without acknowledgement, which I think was the right response. I observed all of this. I wrote all of this. I was, during this period, so preoccupied with recording things that I was occasionally late for my own work, which Brannick noted with a raised eyebrow and a silence that communicated more than words would have. She found my journal. Not in a searching way. I'd left it on the fence rail one afternoon when Consistent had needed attention, and when I came back for it, Saw was sitting nearby with it closed in her hands, not having opened it, just holding it. "I don't read it," she said. "I know you don't. I thought about it. I sat down on the rail, and—" "It is your account," she said, "not mine to read unless you offer." I looked at the journal in her hands. I thought about all the entries, the ones from the station, the ones from the evenings, the ones from that night with Teller. "There's an entry in there," I said slowly, "from the day I first saw you at the station." "What does it say?" I took the journal from her and found the page. I read her what was there. Woman on West Platform, no luggage, no party, train gone, still here, something's wrong. She listened. "That's all," she said. "That's all I managed that first minute." I turned to the addendum below it. Later I wrote, "She is still here. The here is different now." She is still here. She looked at those words for a moment. Her expression was complex, layered, several things happening at once in a face that had learned to hold them simultaneously. "You wrote that I was still here," she said. "Yes." "You thought that was," she searched for the word, "remarkable." "Yes." She was quiet, then she said, "For me, it was simply the only thing that could happen. I could not be anywhere else, not yet." A pause. "It is not brave to be where you are when you have nowhere else to be." "Maybe," I said, "but it's something. You could have stopped being upright. You could have, I've seen people stop being upright, at far less." She turned this over. "My grandmother said," she began, and then paused in the way she paused before quoting her grandmother, which she did rarely enough that I always paid attention when it happened. She said, "A woman who falls is not defeated. A woman who stays on the ground longer than she must, that is a different matter. She was." She made the small gesture with her hand. Not gentle about it, but she meant get up. Always get up. "Your grandmother sounds like someone I would have wanted to know." "She would not have liked you," Saw said, with a directness that surprised a short laugh out of me. "She did not like men who watched too much without acting." "She'd have had a point." "She usually did." But there was something around Saw's eyes when she said it that was warm in a way she wasn't always warm, and I understood that the sharpness of the memory was part of how she carried the person. In the 7th week, she made a decision. She told me before she told Brannick, which meant she was either being polite or she trusted me to handle the information first and react without making it complicated, and I chose to believe the second. She had sent a letter, through Brannick's household, which had a working relationship with the Post, to a woman in the territory who was connected to the Apache community in the north. Not her family directly, her own immediate family was gone. But extended connections. People who would know where she could go, what was available, whether there was a community that would include her in the way communities sometimes could and sometimes couldn't, depending on circumstances and history and the specific texture of what you'd survived and what you were carrying. She had received a response. There was a place, not ideal, not guaranteed, but a place. A family group in the Northern Territory in a region she knew who needed someone with her skills, kitchen management, root cellar, horses, and whatever else she was turning out to be, and who were connected to people who had known her mother. "You're going," I said. "I am considering it," she said. "There is a difference." "But you want to." She thought about it the way she thought about hard questions, genuinely, not performing the consideration. "I want to be in a place where I chose to go," she said finally. "Brannock is fair. This is a good here, but I did not choose it. I arrived here because there was nowhere else." She looked at the corral at Consistent in the near paddock. "I would like to choose." I understood that completely. I wrote it in my journal that night exactly as she said it. I would like to choose. There's no response to that from me. There's no argument. You either understand it or you don't, and if you don't understand it, you probably haven't spent enough time somewhere you didn't choose. She told Brannock the next morning. He listened. He asked 2 practical questions about the destination and the timing and the safety of the route. When she answered them, he nodded. Then he said, "We'll outfit you properly. Horse supplies whatever you need for the journey." He looked at her over the coffee cup. "You've earned your wages these 2 months. I'll have Garrett settle the account." She looked at him for a moment. "You are not going to say I should stay." "I am not. Other men would." "Other men aren't me." He set down the cup. "You told me you wanted to choose, well, choose." The morning she left was 3 days after that conversation, which was enough time to prepare without being enough time to make the preparation sentimental, which I think was the right calibration. Esperanza packed food. More food than was strictly necessary for the journey, which was Esperanza's specific way of communicating affection, through an excess of nourishment, presented without ceremony. Petty stood near the corral with his hands in his pockets and nodded at her. She nodded back. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Brannock shook her hand on the porch, not a gesture he made casually. She received it with equal gravity. I had her horse ready, not Consistent, who was mine, but the bay gelding Brannock had offered, a solid and uncomplicated animal who would cover distance without complaint. She came to where I was standing with the horse, and she took the reins, and she looked at me with that direct, layered quality that I had by now learned was how she looked at things she considered worth looking at fully. "You wrote me in your journal," she said. "I did first page to," I gestured at the present. "Will you keep writing me?" "I'll have a lot less to write about," I said. She got on the horse, smoothly, without hesitation, the way she did most physical things once she decided to do them, and she settled and looked down at me. "Eli," she said. It was the first time she'd used my name. Just my name, nothing attached to it. It stopped me in the way that your own name only stops you when someone says it as if it means something. "The platform," she said. "When you came to the platform, why?" I had asked myself this more than once. I had written several inadequate answers in the journal and crossed them all out. I had one that I thought was close. "My uncle told me to write down what I see," I said. "I saw you, and I didn't want to forget what I was looking at." She regarded me for a long moment. "Your uncle was wise," she said. Then she turned the horse north and rode. I stood at the gate and watched her go until she was past the first ridge and the dust had settled, which took longer than I expected. The morning air was still, and dust doesn't rush. Then I opened the journal. I had meant to write something final, a summary entry. A last observation in the tradition my uncle had taught me. The thing you write when a chapter ends so you know where you are when you start the next one. What I wrote instead was nothing. Or not nothing, I wrote her name. Sa, just that, on the last line of the page with the date above it and the morning light falling across it, which made the ink look different than it usually does. More alive, maybe, or more present. I don't know how much of that was the light and how much was me. I closed the journal. Behind me, the ranch was already starting its day. The sounds of it, the particular morning sounds of animals and men and purpose organized into routine. Consistent was watching me from the paddock with the air of a horse who had opinions about standing still. I went to saddle her. I thought as I worked about what Saw had said on the fence rail in week 4. People think beauty is quiet, but it is not quiet, it presses, it asks something of you. Standing in the barn with the saddle in my hands, I thought I finally understood what it had asked of me. Not much something. Show up, sit down, offer the cornbread. Stay out of the way when the person in front of you is taller than the space you're both standing in. Write it down so you don't forget. That afternoon, I checked the wire office in town. No further contact from teller or the badge man. Nothing from that direction again, as far as I ever knew. The journal from that year is the thickest I kept. More entries, more careful ones than any year before or since. She sent one letter in the spring, 4 sentences. The last one said the horses in the North Territory were faster.